Hello, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to Lecture 16, Ethical Egoism. At this point in the course, we turn our attention to what Ayn Rand has to say regarding morality. She's going to sort of take everything we've talked about all semester and suggest that it's all been completely wrong-headed, right? That there's something at the core of what all of these prior moral theorists have told us that's fundamentally wrong in its essence. And so Rand is going to help us discover, not rediscover, but discover for the first time, she suggests, the true essence or proper view or what the true nature of morality actually is. Okay? So certainly a controversial figure, and so I'm going to make this a two-part, two videos for this lecture. In the first part, we'll talk about Ayn Rand herself, certainly a controversial figure, given, if nothing else, what she has to say about morality. But she's also made a lot of impact, you might say, in the political realm, economics as well. In fact, she's made significant waves in, you might say, a number of facets of our existence in many ways. And one of the things I'll mention here in a moment is just how profound of an influence she seems to have for those who are believers in what she has to say. She's a very polarizing figure, and those who believe in what she has to say are very firm believers, and they tend to, in my experience anyway, the Rand's philosophy tends to impact many veins of their lives. More on that in a moment. So we'll talk in this first part again about Rand and who she is in general. We'll discuss some similarities with some other thinkers, a couple of which we've already discussed, and then Nietzsche. We'll end the course discussing Nietzsche, who implores us to move beyond good and evil. More on that in lecture 18, but we'll see here some similarities between Rand and then these three figures. We'll also discuss egoism. Of course, she's advancing this idea of ethical egoism. Well, what is egoism? We'll flesh that out in more detail. And we'll end the part one video by discussing kind of the general issue she's going to have with all prior moral views, prior moral theories, with the exception of Aristotle. And that's going to be that basically they're self-sacrificing, right? They're at odds, essentially, with her egoism. So that's what we'll do in the part one video. In the part two video, we'll begin then by, as opposed to all these prior moral theories that were wrong for being so self-sacrificing, we're going to then paint the picture of the true or proper view of morality according to Rand, right? So we'll flesh out what the proper view of morality looks like. Namely, it's the view of the ethical egoist according to Rand. And then we'll turn our attention to some more specific problems that she has with the prior moral theories and why then she thinks it's so critical and important for us to abandon these self-sacrificing moral theories as soon as possible. And then we'll offer a summary of what Rand has to say. So that's what we'll do in part two. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive back into what I was suggesting we do here in the part one video. We'll begin with discussing, Ayn Rand. I always feel weird trying to say her name, her first name. Ayn Rand, Ayn Rand, however you're supposed to say it. Ayn Rand, who she is in general, as I mentioned a moment ago, in my experience, very polarizing. People are either big fans or they are very much against what she has to say. And I guess it's not surprising then that she has made big waves, so to speak, in the history of philosophy. And she hasn't been around very long, at least with respect to, philosophy, right? I mean, most of these people, in fact, I'm trying to think, have we even discussed, we've probably discussed one or two at the, up to this point who are still even alive. Most of these philosophers, right, have been dead perhaps thousands of years, like many of these ancients. So Rand, to her credit, if nothing else, right, has made significant waves in a short amount of time. So whether you love her or hate her, she's definitely has made an impact. I have a buddy who was very influenced, and I mentioned a while ago that people influenced by Rand, and I mentioned that people that, in my experience, that are have read Rand's books and that are influenced by her in a positive way, they are influenced in a very significant way. in a way that again affects many aspects of their lives. Like it's that significant of an influence. In other words, we all will read books or we'll have our favorite authors and so on. And somebody asks us, who's your favorite novelist? We might have a few that we'll rattle off. But for people that are, I guess the point is for people who, would rank Rand up there, it's significant, right? They literally have their lives changed in significant ways. And again, I guess I shouldn't say that as if it's true of everybody everywhere, but that's certainly been my experience. And I guess the fact that she's become so popular, or at least controversial in such a short period of time, probably speaks to, again, how significantly she does tend to affect people either, one way or the other. So I guess turning to, what is it, slide 2, also should mention that was born in Russia, moved to America at the age of 21, wrote several, really she's most famous arguably for, her novels. And I brought some props in again from the library. So I actually read The Fountainhead, or at least all but 40 pages. Sorry, Mrs. Honeycutt, from English, senior year English. I wrote my thesis at the end of the year on The Fountainhead, and I got to like the last 40 pages, and I just couldn't finish it. Rand is one of those authors who clearly, is a genius, very good writer. But like Stephen King, I also read a Stephen King novel, it was Desperation. Same sort of thing, where they just seem so, and some of what they say, it just seems so verbose. It's almost as if, couldn't you write it in just half the length? I don't know. Also, who was it? The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I had to read that. I had an instructor at my undergrad institute who was a big fan of that book, and so I literally had to read it for 3 different classes. And another book is like 700 pages, and a great book, but there's some passages that are just extremely long-winded. I remember feeling the same sort of way where some of these great novelists, don't get me wrong, great books, you just get this feeling right, like couldn't it be a little bit shorter? But anyway, I don't know why I ranted about that, but that was my biggest memory from The Fountainhead. But that is the one novel that I've read. I've read significant chunks, but not all of Atlas Shrugged, which is weighing in at over 1,000 pages. It clocks in at 1,074 pages. So, and We the Living's another of her pretty famous novels, and then she also writes, philosophical essays. Very much known in both respects, right, as a novelist, but then also, for her philosophy as well, and clearly her philosophies underlying the novels as well. In fact, everything that I quote, and I mentioned this on slide 2, everything that I'll quote in the lecture is not actually directly from Rand herself. It's from characters in Atlas Shrugged, but of course it's taken to represent Rand's own view. And in fact, the video I link at the very end of the lecture, it's uncanny how similar. So there's the link. It's uncanny how similar in that interview that she does, how similarly she expresses some of the points to the characters in the book. I guess it's not that surprising, right? She wrote the book, but so I guess the point is, right, we can take what the characters say, right, to be indicative then of her thoughts. So that's a very interesting interview as well that we have. There's a few available, by the way. Regardless of what you think of Rand, she is clearly well-spoken, articulate, does great interviews. So highly encourage you to check out not only the one that I provide a link for, but any others that you can find on YouTube. So I mentioned, how, again, very prolific, surprise, surprise, writer, philosopher, known for both, again, fiction, novels, and her philosophy. And her philosophy in general, and she mentions this and speaks about it in the interview, again, that I provided a link to. Her philosophy in general has become known as objectivism, which she, again, herself talks about in interviews. And we're not going to dive too much into what that means, but it's in general, it's just this idea that there is this objective reality, right? I mean, in some sense, to counter Rand real quick, if you think about it, every moment of your life, right, all of reality, as far as depends on your perception of it. How do you know reality exists apart from your perception? Because for all you know, right, it's always been your perception. Rand wants to insist, right, and the underlying essence of objectivism is that, hey, no, don't buy into that, right? You're not that important. There is this objective reality, right, that exists, regardless of if you're here or not, right? That there is this objective reality, and she founds everything in it. But her metaphysics, her epistemological views, and then so too her ethical view is then rooted in this objective reality, right? And so the upshot of that then is going to be her denial of rooting morality and say this God that we can't see, for example, that's not in this physical reality, right? That we can all touch, feel, see, etc. So that underlying objectivist sort of view that again shines through even in her ethical views was, I guess, what we want to take from that. So that's Rand in general. Again, fascinating character. Definitely take a look at, let her speak for herself. She's one of the few, as I mentioned, few characters that we're going to be, encountering, or that we've already encountered, that you can actually go and listen to and hear express their own views themselves. Themselves. Okay, so take advantage of that. So turning our attention to slide 3, want to mention then some similarities to some other critical, or not critical, but well-known thinkers. A couple of whom we've already mentioned, Aristotle and Hobbes, and then Nietzsche, who we'll talk a lot more about down the road at the end of the semester in lecture 18. I guess I'll start with Nietzsche. I've mentioned already in past lectures, I have a fair deal or a fair amount of familiarity with Nietzsche, and so too with Rand. I've read a fair amount of Rand, and I remember having a debate with my dissertation advisor once with respect to the degree of influence that Nietzsche had on Rand. And he was insistent that no, they're not that similar, that she wasn't really that influenced. And, I've always maintained to him, and I still would insist that, there are significant similarities between the two. And I'll mention, some of them as we go. Her critical of nothing else, her critical review of all prior moral theories, suggesting that they're unhealthy, and so on and so forth. We'll see a ton of similarities, and I'll mention similarities when we get to Nietzsche as well, reflecting back on what we're talking about in the Rand lecture, suggesting again how they're similar. But anyway, my dissertation advisor wanted to say no, they're not that similar. Rand was not that influenced by Nietzsche, and I guess in his favor. In the interview that I provide a link to, she herself suggests no, her sole, her only philosophical influence is Aristotle, which I don't know how you could say that. And again, I would maintain that she had to have been familiar with Nietzsche. The similarities are just they're there, and they're too palpable. And again, we'll see the ways in which they're similar as we proceed. So then Aristotle, there's no denying, Rand herself comes right out and is very emphatic about the extent to which Aristotle has influenced her. And you might even argue, he gets kind of an exemption from her criticisms of all prior moral theories, right? He might be the only one that kind of got stuff right. But for the most part, right, all the other prior moral theorists, they're all completely wrong. She has a great deal of respect, though, for Aristotle. Who, again, not only was he a primary influence or significant influence, but supposedly the sole influence, her sole philosophical influence was Aristotle. So, and you can see, excuse me, you can see the ways in which, Rand's views and what she has to say is similar to the kinds of things that Aristotle says. They both emphasize, for example, how important happiness is. Eudaimonia, as Aristotle would say, right, that Greek term. Well, that's also critically important for Rand. And what should you do? Ultimately, spoiler alert, whatever promotes your own happiness, your own flourishing and survival. I mentioned, right, in this bullet point towards the middle of the slide, right, she centers her moral theory around the individual's pursuit of happiness. Quote, happiness is the successful state of life, end quote. That's a quote from Rand Atlas Shrugged. Right? So, how do we measure whether or not we're successful? And that even smacks of Aristotle, right? This discussion of purposes, right? Fulfilling our function. And then if we do so well, then we're virtuous. What is successful or doing things well? What does that look like for Rand? Being happy. Okay, well, that's exactly what it meant for Aristotle. So the way they talk about, what our goal is, that's similar. What our goal is, being happy, that's similar. So a lot of similarities with Aristotle, which, again, she herself makes well known. Okay? And then finally, I would point out that she's very similar to Hobbes, because again, we started the course more or less. That was kind of our first moral theory that we dove into, was moral conventionalism, Hobbes's theory. So I thought it is of interest to us to then compare what Rand is saying with him, because I think they're very similar. They're both egoists, and as we'll see, of both versions or both kinds, right? They're both psychological and ethical egoists, and they're going to say things that are very similar. So I guess we'll go ahead, and it's a nice segue then to discuss egoism, because they both are, right? How are Rand and Hobbes similar? Well, they're both, egoists, and there's not a lot of philosophers that we've discussed who I would think would label themselves as egoists. Most would shun that label. So, but Rand and Hobbes, I think, would both willingly endorse that. Obviously, this idea that people. So, what is egoism? This, turning to slide 4. This idea that what matters is self-interest. Okay. Now, don't conflate it with hedonism. The idea that what matters, right, above all else, is pleasure. Okay. Our self-interest may or may not amount to pleasure and nothing else, right? Some might think that they are, right, one and the same, but some might say that it's in our self-interest to not constantly cater to pleasure. Okay, so those are not one and the same. Be careful not to conflate hedonism and egoism, but they do then kind of admit of a similar distinction, though, right? Just like we had psychological hedonists and ethical hedonists, well, it's important to distinguish that there are two different versions of egoism then, right? This notion that what matters is self-interest. Well, in what sense? And by the way, the editors of the textbook, right, they allude to this, and they stress the importance as well of keeping these clear, right? There are a lot more, for what it's worth, psychological egoists than there are ethical egoists, okay? Because this is an important difference, and that's why we're emphasizing it, right? So you might have, for example, many psychological egoists who then say the proper thing to do is somehow try to overcome that psychological tendency we have. So what are these different versions? I guess I should back up and explain them real quick, right? So egoism in general is this notion that what matters is self-interest. And the psychological egoist says, for better or worse, right or wrong, right? The idea being there's no moral undertones here. People, as a matter of fact, do just naturally pursue their own self-interest. Okay? Right or wrong, good or evil, okay? No moral undertones here. As a matter of fact, right, it's a sort of natural tendency. People just pursue their own self-interest, okay? Whereas the ethical egoist is going to then say, they typically also tend to be psychological egoists, but the ethical egoist is going to suggest, and the proper thing to do, right, is to cater to that pursuit of our self-interest, or what we ought to do, right? So that's the moral version, right? What we ought to do is whatever promotes this pursuit of our self-interest, our own flourishing and survival. Okay, but again, do remember that these are distinct, okay, and that there are many for whom psychological egoism rings true. This idea that we have a natural tendency to pursue our own self-interest, but then they might want to say, what we ought to then do is try to mitigate that, minimize it as much as that is possible, right? Minimize that constant tendency we have to pursue our own self-interest, and then instead to factor others in, cater to everyone else, right, in some shape or form. And of course, that's going to be precisely what Rand finds deeply problematic. But anyway, so going back to this egoism, know what egoism is in general, but then also know that there are these two distinct flavors, if you will. But her and Hobbes, they're going to subscribe to both these versions. Okay? They're both psychological and ethical egoists. Okay? As a matter of fact, we do tend to pursue our own self-interest. Now, Rand might say, unless we're like sickly and acting on the standard of death, which more on that in a moment, right, are acting like a sacrificial animal, which so many of us, insofar as we're influenced by, she would say, religion and these traditional moral theories, that's what we tend to do. Okay? In that case, we would be cutting off our own self-interest. And that's the sense in which she thinks we're sickly. But setting those negative influences aside, if we were to act naturally, right, Rand would say, by all means, right, we have a natural tendency to pursue our own self-interest. And then she, like Hobbes, is going to suggest we ought to do whatever promotes our own self-interest, our own flourishing and survival. Now, that doesn't mean do whatever you want necessarily, right? Rand doesn't, just because she's going to suggest you ought to do whatever promotes your own flourishing and survival, that doesn't mean take out everyone around you, because she's going to recognize, again, she's going to emphasize the importance of reason and reflecting. She's going to recognize if you do that, that's not going to be in your own interest, because everybody else is going to start taking you out. So she's going to make many concessions like Hobbes and suggest, hey, agreeing not to do everything you want to do all the time, that's actually going to be in your own interest, right? Don't just start taking everybody out because you realize, you could do whatever promotes your own interest. Well, that's not necessarily in your own interest. Okay? Don't go and start stealing from everybody, right? Just because you're now championing ethical egoism, because that's not necessarily going to be in your own interest when you get caught and then sent to prison, or they start reciprocating that sort of behavior towards you. Okay? So be careful. I guess the point here is, just like Hobbes, be careful that you don't, automatically associate certain sort of consequences to Rand's endorsement of ethical egoism. Okay, both like Hobbes, both of these thinkers can endorse ethical egoism and then, suggest we ought to be cautious. Right? That doesn't mean just start doing whatever you want all the time. Okay. All right. Now, having discussed the underlying, egoism that underlies everything Rand has to say, let's turn our attention then to what she should suggest is problematic about all these prior moral theories. That's why we're here, right? To suggest or to discuss morality. Well, what does Rand have to say about all these prior moral theories that we've been discussing, things like utilitarianism and deontology? Well, let's go ahead and turn to slide 5 then. So again, all this is coming from Atlas Shrugged, her novel, and the textbook I used to work with, the previous one, did have a portion of Atlas Shrugged, and so that's why I take the particular quotes that I have. They are left over from the lecture from when I was working with that textbook. Anyway, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, though, I would still suggest that although these are from characters in the novel, they're still indicative of Rand herself and what she thought, okay, as suggested in the video where she's talking about her own views. Okay, so again, slide 5. What's the issue here? Okay, we have a moral crisis on our hands. She announces that we're in an age of a moral crisis, but claims, quote, "What you now need is not to return to morality, you who have never known any, but to discover it." So what's the suggestion here? There's been something fundamentally flawed about all of our prior approaches to morality, and hence all these prior moral theories, right, that have come before her time. In other words, pretty much all the moral theories that we've spent the course studying and discussing up to this point, with the exception, as I've mentioned, of perhaps Aristotle. There's been something fundamentally wrong with all these moral theories, something misleading, and of course, her job is going to be then to sort of announce what the problem is, okay, and turning our attention then to slide 6. Well, what is the problem? I already alluded to this earlier. The problem is that they sever, right, what she thinks matters, and that's our self-interest. Okay, being an egoist, none of these prior moral theories are going to sit well with her then, because what's sort of the general theme of all these prior traditional moral theories? They're self-sacrificing, they're sacrificial, and hence at odds, again, with anyone that's an egoist and thinks that what we ought to do is pursue our own interests, because they are telling us in one way or another, typically, that the job of morality, if you're doing the right thing, is to stop turning your attention to yourself, your own interests, what would help you survive and flourish, but instead to start factoring in others, right, and to cater to the preferences and desires of not just yourself, but others, okay, and not just necessarily human beings either, but we've talked about how maybe it's other sentient creatures, all sentient creatures out there, okay, and so in one way, shape, or form, all these prior traditional moral theories, at their core is this tendency, right, or require, if you're living up to these theories, right, and trying to uphold them, it's going to be this tendency then for you to turn away from your own interests and desires, hence sacrifice yourself and cater then to instead others. Okay? And doing that and allowing others more consideration, at the very least, implicit in that is, right, a reduction in the consideration of your own wants and desires. Okay, and so all of that is going to be the impetus then for her, the manner in which she speaks a lot of times, right? When she says things like, they require you to act on the standard of death. Well, that's the way in which she means that, right? Because it's not healthy. It's not on the standard of life when you do that, right? Instead, it's the opposite. It's doing what won't help you survive and flourish because you're turning your attention away from that. Right? That's the fundamental idea with these traditional moral theories. You have to turn your attention away from your own life, your own flourish, and your own survival, and instead focus on the life of others. Okay? So in doing that, you're going to be required to act on the standard of death, she says. Act like a sacrificial animal, a suicidal animal. Okay? And again, this is all why she says that. And contrary to that, right, if you uphold instead the proper view of morality, well, then you'd be, in other words, if you endorse her ethical egoism, resist this temptation to act on tradition, these traditional moral theories, right, and instead uphold ethical egoism, then you're going to be acting on the standard of life. You're going to be healthy. Okay? You're going to be acting like a rational animal, a truly rational animal, because you're going to be doing things that help you survive and flourish, and that's what's actually rational. Okay, so we're trying to paint sort of a general picture of what the problem is with all these prior moral theories. So like Nietzsche, similarity here, what she's doing is she's turning her attention back and she's reflecting back on all these prior moral theories. And like Nietzsche, she suggests that they all fall into one of two categories. So let's go ahead. What did I do with my eraser? So we know that all these moral theories, what's problematic is they're self-sacrificing. Okay? And she says, and they all fall into one of two camps. Okay, so traditional self-sacrificing. Oh boy. Whoops, that's a name. Okay, you know what that is. Self-sacrificing moral theories. Okay, they fall into one of two camps, the social or the mystical. Nietzsche, as we'll see in lecture 18, he's going to reflect back on all prior moral theories and suggest that they fall into one of two camps, slave or master moral theories. Okay, more on that in lecture 18. But again, similarity to Nietzsche, reflects back on all these prior moral theories and says, they all fall into one of two camps. They're either the social or the mystical. And regardless, one way or another, they all put us in the role of servants. Again, requiring us not to decide and figure out what would further our own interests, survival, and flourishing, but rather what would help others around us, right? What would promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number? Or, and sort of think like more religious moral theories, right? What would behoove God, right? Or what God wants us to do, never mind necessarily what we ourselves want to do, right? So in one way or another, all these prior moral theories, they're requiring us to be servants, either to our neighbors or to God, okay? And in both respects then, one way or another, again, we're cutting off our own healthy existence, if you will, that's implicitly happening insofar as we're taking, removing attention from our own survival, flourishing, and so on, sustenance and so on, and instead devoting attention either to God or to our neighbors. Okay, so again, this is what I'm getting at on slide 6. As a result, she says, quote, "Your pleasure, you have been taught, is to be found in immorality. Your interests would be best served by evil, and any moral code must be designed not for you, but against you, not to further your life, but to drain it." And so we're brought up thinking that morality is about, again, focusing on others, and doing the right thing in some fashion is going to entail not focusing on yourself, but instead focusing on others. And so that's the sense in which she's saying morality, right? Serving morality, right? That's going to be severing your own interest, right? It's against you. So we get the general issue, right? Is that from these traditional moral theories, is they're pitting what's moral, and they're saying, hey, if you're doing the right thing, right, they're pitting that versus what Rand wants to say is what's natural, rational, she would call it, say, practical as well. These prior moral theories, they're suggesting that what's truly what we want to do, what's natural to us, and what's really rational, Rand would say, and what's practical, what's going to help us survive and flourish for a longer period of time. All these moral theories, at least if not explicitly, what's implied in them, right, is that that's all at odds with doing the right thing. Right? Focusing on that, no, that's not doing the right thing. The more you think about yourself, right, and what you want, the suggestion is that's not doing the right thing. And we're, as we'll see in the part 2 video, when Rand discusses all the issues, right, that's going to lead to a large amount of guilt on our part because we can't help. It's natural for us to want to pursue our own interests, to be happy ourselves, and to survive and flourish. But we're told growing up and taught by all these, traditional moral theories that the proper thing to do is not to focus on yourselves. And so when we naturally do this, we can't help but feel guilty, Rand says. Right? But anyway, right, the right thing to do is to stop focusing on yourself so much. Think like Kant. Kant is the perfect example. Okay, the more you allow your inclinations, your own personal inclinations, to steer what it is you're doing. Remember, for Kant, the less morally praiseworthy what you're doing is, and that's exactly what Rand has in mind here. Right, Kant's telling us that what's moral is not catering to what you want, what's of interest to you, what will help you survive and flourish. Right? To do the right thing, you have to not think about that, and instead think about others. Right? Not focus on your own inclinations. This is what is the problem for Rand, right? Is that they're pitting, right, all these traditional problematic moral theories are pitting these two against each other. And of course, what she's going to want to suggest, as we'll discuss at the beginning of the part 2 video, is that a proper view of morality, yes, there is a such thing as morality, right? In the proper sense of it, a proper view of it, the view of the ethical egoist is going to marry these two. Right? The right thing to do is going to be whatever's natural, practical, and rational. Whatever you want to do, whatever's going to help you flourish and survive. Right? But again, the traditional prior moral theories, no, they didn't suggest that. They're suggesting again that these are at odds. Now, of course, they wouldn't probably explicitly say that. Usually, I mean, Kant kind of does in some sense, right? He doesn't necessarily spell it out in these precise terms, but he says, again, doing the right thing means not catering to your own inclinations and so on. Right? And in doing that, again, that's the problem. That's what creates all the issues then, again, the guilt, the lowered self-esteem, which we'll discuss and elaborate on at the end of the lecture 2, or the part 2 video. Okay, so hopefully you're starting to get a feel for the issue here. Sacrificial moral code split, quote, mankind into two enemy camps. One is you, the other is all the rest of humanity, end quote. Quote, no one came to say that your life belongs to you, and the good is to live it, end quote. That's the problem. So both of these types of self-sacrificing moral theories, they're problematic because they're self-sacrificing, right? They're removing our focus on this and suggesting what we ought to be doing instead, right, is something else. And that's not healthy. That's not natural. That's not rational, Rand's going to suggest. So according to such moral codes, that's what I'm getting at on 7 here, slide 7. So according to such moral codes, right here, the moral and the practical are at odds. They're opposites, but they shouldn't be. That's going to be Rand's view, but they're treated as such by these traditional moral theories, which instead of being rational, or instead, she wants to say, they suggest there's nothing rational. These moral theories, they're not reasonable, right? If we're being rational, we would just discard them right away. Rather, she says they're rooted in force and fraud, or sorry, faith, right, and force. Faith and force, right? Insofar as we either have to take them on faith, or sometimes, especially back in the day, if you didn't uphold certain convictions, certain viewpoints, then you were threatened with death, right? So they're certainly not rational, she wants to say. And actually, turning to slide 8, then, speaking a little bit more to the purpose of reason. Reason, it's interesting. Rand has a lot of, again, a philosopher stressing the import of reason. What a surprise, right? But it's interesting. She has, like, her view of reason is very reminiscent of Nietzsche again. This reason, this rational, reflective process that we have, this ability that we have, seems to distinguish us, Rand suggests, from other sentient creatures, other animals. And like Nietzsche, it seems to be both a blessing and a curse, right? It has the potential for both. It can help us if used properly, Rand would say. It can help us survive and flourish, which, is the goal. It's what we want to do, right? It's what we ought to do. It can help us figure out, a la Hobbes, that, hey, to best survive and flourish, we probably shouldn't do whatever we want, right? Reason exercised properly will allow us to figure some of those kinds of things out, just like Hobbes suggested. But the problem in this reason and rational capacity is that then we also have the ability to convince ourselves of all kinds of other crazy stuff, Rand would say. Like, for example, that the proper thing to do is to not focus on what we ourselves want and instead think all the time about others. Okay? Non-rational creatures, the rest of the animal kingdom, arguably, right? I mean, you don't see that, right? You don't see this in general, like them convincing themselves that the proper thing to do is shun their own interest and cater to others. Rather, in the rest of nature, the typical tendency tends to be to constantly be egoistic, right? And to do whatever would promote one's own flourishing and survival. It's only the rational species that has this capacity to fool themselves or convince themselves that the proper thing to do, delude themselves, you might say, into thinking the proper thing to do is to cut off this natural instinct to, want to do what promotes your own flourishing and survival, instead to cater to others. Very reminiscent of Nietzsche. What he'll call the will to power is this, he'll say the will to power expresses anything that's alive. And insofar as it's alive, it's going to do whatever it needs to flourish and survive. And Nietzsche's going to say that, insofar as we become victim to these slave moral theories, as he'll call them, or religions, or so on. It cuts off that natural will to power. It's unhealthy, and so on. And so that's the same sort of thing Rand's is saying here, that reason can be a blessing, or as it's turned out to be for so many of us, she suggests, it's been a curse, because unlike us rational creatures, other animals, they don't convince themselves, again, to act on the standard of death, she'll say. So let me go ahead and use some of her words to sort of make the points I've been making here, right? So she describes, again, the human mind as a basic, if properly thought of, right? Our reason, our reflective ability, our capacity, right? That's, if properly thought of, should be a tool for survival, a means to, again, best figure out what we ought to do to survive and flourish. Okay? To survive, she says, we have to act, and before we can act, right, we sort of contemplate things and reflect and think. We have to. And then so that's the reason why she says, quote, to remain alive, he must think, right? We have this reflective capacity that other sentient creatures don't have. Right? Quote, but to think is an act of choice, end quote. And this is why Rand says, quote, man is a being of volitional consciousness, end quote. And this is going to be, as I mentioned, this is the middle of slide 8. This is going to reflect a critical difference that we've been sort of alluding to here between human beings and other animals. Other animals, they don't have to think and choose to survive, right? It's just an automatic process. They're always acting on what she would call the standard of life. They just instinctively always do whatever promotes their own flourishing and survival. Right? They are just instinctively egoists, right? And they just carry it out. But what happens with us, right, is that we screw it up in that, that thinking part, right? We somehow screw it up. We cut off that natural egoism that we ought to let, just go unfettered, right? And in that process, we then we act on the standard of death, she would say, which isn't even possible for other animals because they lack that capacity to derail themselves by way of this reflective capacity. Okay, so again, that reflective capacity, it's really our downfall here. It's what's allowing us to convince ourselves of things that aren't natural and healthy and so on. Okay, and that's the problem then for her. So plants and animals, they automatically value life. They don't have to think about it. So speaking of an animal, Rand says, quote, "It is unable to ignore its own good, unable to decide to choose the evil and act as its own destroyer." And of course, she's going to argue that that's precisely what human beings, insofar as they tend to endorse these traditional moral theories, traditional religious views, and so on, that's precisely what we tend to do, is, again, act on the standard instead of death and cater to others, and instead of acting on the standard of our own life and what would help us flourish and survive. Okay. So human beings, turning to slide 9, we have that idea of a suicidal animal that becomes a possibility because of our rational capacity, and specifically when we're not properly using it, she would say. So human beings, on the other hand, are not such automatic creatures, right? We have the ability, thanks to our rational capacity, to screw things up. So for us, self-preservation, living, that's not instinctual, right? And as it turns out, most of us don't act on that standard. Rather, again, we tend to act on the standard of death, she would say. So the following snippet, as I mentioned on slide 9, especially revealing, quote, she says, quote, "Man must obtain his knowledge and choose his actions by a process of thinking, which nature will not force him to perform. Man has the power to act as his own destroyer, and that is the way he has acted throughout most of his history," end quote. So, as rational beings, again, there's this suggestion that we have a fundamental option here. We can be truly rational beings insofar as we exercise our rational capacity properly and use it to facilitate that pursuit of our own happiness and flourishing. Right? Or we can be suicidal animals, right? And fail to use that rational capacity appropriately. Instead, use it in a way that sort of allows us to convince ourselves, by way of illusions, Nietzsche might say, right? Deception, self-deception, that the proper thing to do is to cut off our own instinct for survival, flourishing, and happiness. So with this in mind, Rand deems anyone who does not have his or her own life as the motive and goal of his or her actions a, quote, metaphysical monstrosity, end quote, a kind of fundamental contradiction. And this is, the reason why she said such a person is said to act on the motive and standard of death. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. What does she mean when she says somebody's acting on the standard of death? And again, that's representative of most people, she would say, insofar as they believe in these traditional moral theories. Well, hopefully it's clear now what she means when she says they're acting on the standard of death. They're turning away from their own flourishing and survival, and they're cutting off their own, again, natural, healthy instinct to cater to their own wants and desires, and instead focusing on others, okay, or God. Okay. So I think that's where we'll wrap up the first part video. We've again talked about who Ayn Rand is. We talked about some similarities with her and Nietzsche and Hobbes, and obviously Aristotle. We discussed egoism, the different flavors of egoism, and we discussed in general what the problem is with all these prior moral theories. Namely, they're at odds with ethical egoism, right? Which she thinks is the proper moral view. So for the next video, then the part 2 video, we'll go ahead then and flesh out ethical egoists. What they're going to suggest, what Rand's going to suggest is the proper moral view, namely doing whatever you want, right? Whatever helps you pursue your own flourishing and survival. So we'll flesh that out. We'll also then get into, I mentioned a few of these already, some of the specific criticisms she has with the traditional moral theories, why she thinks they're so problematic. We saw what the issue is in general here, but what's so problematic about these prior moral theories? Well, like we alluded to earlier, she thinks it's natural to want to pursue your own survival and flourishing, and insofar as they're telling us that's not the proper thing to do, well, then that's going to make us feel guilty. And insofar as we can't help but do that, again, it's natural, and we keep screwing up and hence feel all this guilt, well, that's going to lower our self-esteem and so on. So we'll elaborate on a lot of these issues that she thinks plague these traditional prior moral theories, which again is all the more reason she suggests we ought to discard them immediately. And then we'll summarize again all the sort of points we've been making in both the videos. So that's the game plan here. Hopefully you enjoyed this first part. And until the second part, I'll go ahead and leave you with the intermission questions here. Basically, at this point, just asking what you think of egoism. Are you an egoist in general? Do you subscribe to psychological egoism and or ethical egoism? Okay. And then number two, what do you think of this idea that all prior moral theories, this is a pretty significant claim, right? All prior moral theories have been fundamentally flawed. There's something screwed up, in their very essence. There's something that's been wrong at their core. That we haven't even known the proper sense of morality up to Rand's point. Do you agree with that? So why not? If you want to chime in on those for your forum post. Again, until the part 2 video, I'll see you later. Thanks.